What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Iron Chapel. Today we're going to go over how to squat, and this is going to be a detailed video of how to do a back squat. We'll cover a little bit of high bar and low bar squat, but I'm not going to go too much into that today. I can make another detailed video on that if we get a good amount of likes and views on this video. So let's get started. So first, let's talk about equipment. Specifically, the first piece of equipment is a belt. Now, you don't need a belt for squatting. It helps when you get up into heavier weight that your core is challenged. But if you can breathe and brace the right way, which I'll talk about later, then there's no need for a belt. Second thing is shoes. I use minimalist lifting slippers just because I like them for having them here in the home gym. But if you have Converse, I highly recommend those too, or weightlifting shoes with an elevated heel. Those are also one of your best bets. Basically, what to look for with a lifting shoe for squatting, you just want a bottom that's solid and grippy so that your feet don't slide and so that it's not absorbing any of the pressure you put in the floor to lift the weight back up. Otherwise, your numbers will be lower than they would otherwise. You could lift barefoot. That's recommended by some people that say that you should have your toes spread and have a barefoot plant on the floor, but that doesn't have any support in the arch. But then also you could strengthen your arch from squatting barefoot too, and that also works. But if you're squatting heavy already and you try to squat barefoot with that heavy weight and you don't have a strong foot, then you might have some issues. So I do recommend Converse or something with a solid base and a grippy bottom. So we'll actually talk about the setup of the squat at the end of the video because that is the least important part of how to squat. The most important part is breathing and bracing. And that is basically breathing into your belly and then bracing your core so that you create stiffness in your trunk to support your spine even better than the muscles already can. And that you want to do for all lifts essentially. But there's three main pillars to squatting. There's balance, back angle, and range of motion. We'll go over balance first, and that basically just means having the weight over the middle of the foot and balancing between your 2 feet as well, which I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But those are the three pillars, and we'll talk about those. So to help a lifter figure out their balance, what I like to do is have them go on their toes and then on their heels and find a spot right in the middle. Also, what helps too is having the bar and visualizing it over the middle of your foot the entire movement. Obviously, you don't want to watch it there because that'll put you in an imbalance and then you'll have even worse balance as you're going because you gotta move your head and everything. But just visualize that if you're thinking about where your body is, and just have that balance over the middle of your foot and feel heavy equally on the balls of your feet and your heels. You don't want to be on your toes or on your heels the whole time. And also that has to do with knee movement. Don't worry about knees going over toes. A lot of specifically like high school football coaches, they'll always say, don't let your knees go over your toes. It's terrible for your knees and it's bad form. It's not bad form. I would recommend your knees go over your toes. Otherwise you'll probably be too much on your heels. And also you want to think about balance side to side on your right and left foot and find a spot in the middle that it's even distribution on both feet. So if you can follow that main rule, then your squat will probably be just fine. So I did say that bracing your core is the most important thing with the squat, but let's take into account that that is the most important thing in lifting in general. So focusing solely on the squat, balance is the most important thing. Because if you are too much on your heels, you're hitting too much posterior chain, the weight might even fall, like you might actually fall over, and that's not an efficient squat, obviously, and it's unsafe. And also on your toes, then you're putting too much on your calves, too much on your knees. And a reason some people might be too much on their toes is poor ankle mobility, and that actually forces them on their toes because their ankles can't move enough. Now let's talk about back angle. What I mean by back angle is the angle that your back makes to the ground. So you want to keep your back angle consistent through the whole lift. You don't want it to move too far back or too far vertical.
because that's an inefficient squat. And that also has to do with balance. If your balance is off, chances are your back angle will fluctuate a little bit. And this happens with a lot of experienced lifters too, which requires other training cues, which I'll talk about a little later. But this is basically what it looks like when you have a poor back angle. If your hips shoot up too early or your knees shoot forward too early. And that basically just makes the movement very inefficient, and you're not going to get what you can out of the squat. Now, I could make an entire video talking about range of motion, but basically range of motion, you just want to have your squat as deep as you can comfortably get with moderate weight. If you're going too heavy, it's pretty obvious because you can't get to a deep squat. You could go ATG, full depth, if you really want to. That actually is the most efficient for gaining strength and hypertrophy, so building muscle, but it's not necessary for most people. If you're powerlifting, sometimes it's better to just lift with the powerlifting crease of the hip below the knee, below parallel depth, because that is what you need for sport, and that's the most efficient for you. Now, also being a strength coach for specifically athletes, I do have to take into account some science with this. And I see a lot of athletes, specifically like track athletes, nothing against them, but a lot of them will end up squatting with very low range of motion because they think that training much heavier weight in only the top range of motion is all they need to get powerful for specifically like throwing or sprinting. But if you squat in a fuller range of motion, that will dramatically increase your strength and health of all your joints in the long run. And it's just overall full range of motion just has better muscle activation and more strength response to your stimulus that you're putting down.
So now let's talk about setup for the squat. Typically, the biggest variation is where you place your feet. Because everyone has different hip size and proportions in their legs, so figuring out a stance is pretty like trial and error. For me, I like a more narrow stance usually, especially if I'm going full depth, I like it more narrow. But if I'm going a normal squat, then I go a little bit wider, and I like a little bit of a moderate angle of my toes. Like too far out puts a lot of strain on the groin and on the hips, and too narrow doesn't give you the room you need when you get in the bottom. So what I like to do is stand. I do mine basically shoulder width, straight down, and that's where I put my feet and angle them slightly out.
So setup with the bar is much less complicated. The only thing that really varies with this is where you put your hands, but that just matters on how tight you are. So when setting up for a high bar squat, you want to put the bar on your traps, which is the muscle that connects from your neck down to your shoulders. And obviously this is more comfortable when you have meatier traps, but if you feel for the top of your scapula, your collarbone, and shrug your traps up, and you'll feel that muscle in the top of the collarbone, which is where you want the bar to be. Now for a low bar squat, you want to feel for your rear delts and put the bar on top of that, as I show here. And you can really see the shelf that the bar sits on for a low bar squat is literally your shoulders. And this puts the bar a bit further down on your back so you could bend over more and get more hip drive if that's what the type of squat that you like. Personally, I'm a more high bar squat person, but so here are two quick examples of heavy squats. Now this first one is my buddy Mario. It's his 405 max squat, and this is a great looking squat. The only thing that I would note to him is that his hips shoot up, and you'll see it on his way up, but he's been working to train to fix that, and it's not as dramatic as what it used to be, so good for him on fixing that there. And then also here's my recent PR that I matched from last year before I had my knee injury, and this is a powerlifting depth squat. I'm not doing as much ATG squatting anymore, but this one also looks really good. I couldn't find much wrong with it, except I have a little bit of the same thing where my hips shoot up a tiny bit, but it's not very drastic at all, not too much to worry about. So that's how to squat, and we'll see y'all again soon.